anthropological sources, much in the way of news sources, well, anthropological sources, is that when they talk about religion, they're not always talking about the religion itself. They may be talking about other religions too. They may be talking about just the so-called popular form of a religion, which is not actually the religion. It's something separate. It's just people who were considered part of religion as doing. The politics of a people in a region does not make something, for example, popular or political Islam. It doesn't work that way. And this volume certainly will mention things that is not explicitly Islam or even an expression of Islam. And like that G.E. von Grunebaum had to say was he compared the As-Salafist Saleh movement to basically what Protestantism should be, a true fundamentalist movement, not as some term of liberal hate speech where, oh, if you're devout, you're a fanatic. No. Or a fundamentalist is somebody like, for example, in the Christian tradition who abandons holidays like Christmas and Easter and other unbiblical celebrations and actually tries to look at the parts of the Bible that don't contradict the other parts of the Bible and follow those. One thing that you find mentioned is a fallacy that's been repeated over and over and over again, even to the point where people from the Muslim population are starting to repeat it, is the simple fact of some people, despite the lack of contradictions and scientific errors and problems with actual history that's been verified instead of just presumed a bunch of people say different things, we find that there's people who can't, even though everything big and small, good and true, can be linked to Quran, there's people who don't find their guidance and they don't know what to do. And there are people who, even upon looking at the narrations about what Muhammad ibn Abdullah was reported to have, said, it's, they even don't. So what's the next step? Well, there's the community of believers, and after that is the analogy. So the third or fourth set of law, but it's something that everybody agrees on, then it becomes self-justified. The Quran has a phrase, the way of the believers. And believers a higher station than just saying you believe something. You got to be modest and protect your prayers and all sorts of stuff. It's an attainable state. But in this book, I don't think they mentioned the term because the whole Wahhabi thing didn't exist back here as a hate speech for the As-Salaf Saleh or the Muwahideen. Because a lot of what people have to say with Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, you just don't find it. And you do find a difference between the Persian and the Arabic culture being spoken of. And you find a degree spoken of in some of these empires that were at least Muslim majorities. And to the degree, like, for example, there is no war on Christmas. The country is 53% Christian at most. All those who don't worship Jesus, who don't treat him as a god, they should have the right, as we find here with the case of a particular missionary in one of these stories being brought, is that the missionary wanted some things written down, And the person didn't want to take any part in writing out the Bible passages in Arabic that referred to things that conflicted with Al Quran, and that's his right. Um, Now, on my channel, I report on a whole lot of things, but am I saying go off and do things? There's certainly even the degree of human sacrifice to the devil has happened in this country. And in saying that, am I saying go off and do it? No. No, I'm saying that this is done. And so, but I don't want to take part in promoting things that I don't believe in, that I don't think that my judgment says not to do it, but judgment being supported. And vice versa, there was also the freedom. The Christians in these empires and other people of other faiths could worship as they pleased. And you found a lot of recording and codification of other traditions in these communities. The Yazidi had their tradition translated, what they had remaining of their what is now 30,000-year-old tradition. They're 5,700 something year old since the last major revelation, their current calendar. As offensive as their tradition is, the worship of the jinn, particularly shaitan, malaktaus, wanting to become one with the jinn, they're like, that's like some horror movie possession sort of thing. But they're not, the movies are different than what your typical Satanist is going to be. You find that the so-called Zoroastrians, by whatever name they were called, the Zervons and the Mazdayasnaha, Zarathustraha, Mazdayasnian, Zarathustrian, the people who are doshed, their tradition also in the Shahnameh was recorded. Their Denkare was also recorded under Islamic rule. There were exceptions, but are we to blame this on religion? And, there's, of course, the issue of modernization. And the issue of modernization shouldn't be an issue of moving towards what is popular, but figuring out how to do with new technologies and new situations, how to follow the same old methods. And these methods are very clearly, it's, not everything's instant in life. If you ask me a question on what are the scriptural passages that refer to a particular issue, I can try to find that. Now, I can get overwhelmed with online questions, but I can try to find all that stuff. Chapter and verse, narration numbers, ethnic things, esoteric, exoteric ways, eisegesis, exegesis, whatever term you're using to think of these things. So the acceptance of technology, you did find in the early generations in the Islamic world that, people didn't know what to do with new clothes and new food, even though they had the rules. They had the examples that could have taught them and to not be so closed off, to be freezing cold in winter and pile on a series of thobes trying to keep warm. I've seen immigrants do that. But eventually they learn, and it's not because they're not smart. It's that you spend your whole life. People in America die of heat exhaustion because they're not dressed right in the hot weather. Either they're too exposed, or they're wearing tight clothes, or they don't know how to, 90 degrees, people dying of heat stroke. Just don't be fully, so the food and the clothes, we were told to eat the local food, wear the local clothes, as long as we're following the rules of modesty and not merely just imitating the belief, the people who believe differently. And the westernization started, leaving Arabia. They, had to adapt to other cultures, and cultural inflection is fine. I'm not saying that's different, but a lot of cultural inflection is made required by some people. It's even gone to point of picking up stuff like circumcision. Now, are we supposed to circumcise when they're 15 years old or 8 years old, 7 years old, 8th day of life? Well, it depended on what the community did before they were Muslim, right? And where's the thing where the Prophet taught it? No, it's not there. And particularly the colonial period, they've picked up a lot of things that now we say are inappropriate. But it's not the religion. But in this push for westernization and self figuring out, because we can't look at things anymore and say, my belief is stronger than your belief, or my ancestors believe this, so we don't. The Quran doesn't have that approach. You investigate what is said about history. You look at the remains, archaeological remains. That's a recommendation, although you don't stay too long in a place of destruction. So life starts out pretty simple, and you build yourself over time, and it becomes something so complex that people look at it and say, oh, look at that mountain. I can't pick up that mountain, but a rock at a time. Different things came across over time, and I have looked at some stuff that I perhaps should have turned it into a little book, and had I had more time, I would have done that. But just like my exposure to all sorts of different types, which has led me to interpret things like the Bible and stuff differently by looking at how all these philosophers, their methods, not their quotes, their methods, over 60 philosophers, Nietzsche, Aristotle, Dostoevsky, Thomas Hobbes. I'm not going to list them all, but you know the idea. There's going to be from a long, various Stoics and Seneca, the Stoic. I could explain things in terms of Seneca, but I think there's a quote in here that refers, part of here that refers to Seneca, because Seneca thought that being a tyrant was okay as long as it gave the freedom to develop, for the opportunity to arise to develop proper philosophy. So if the thought, if a person's preserved enough in their mind that tyranny, constitutional, the general push of what Islamic law is supposed to. Neither the head of state nor the populace can institute a bunch of super strict laws that bounds. Muhammad Iqbal shows the greatness of responding in poetry, and various other poets. Obviously, you would have people like Forms. Yeah, there's a difference. Some of the reforms are, people don't like Islam anymore, so let's try to change some things. Reforms are justified in other ways because they're saying, hey, here's all these really old traditions, and why can't we follow things directly for ourselves? And again, like, we used to. And some Shia Sufi sheikh to our peer to interpret things for us, it's, pretty basic. But when you look at the understanding of others, the understanding of others is something that something that you never noticed. So I strongly recommend listening to what people have to say. Not that you have to change your mind, but to respond to the various paths in the world, the different types of things. But in looking at the Mutazilites, be careful of, and the Gnostics and all sorts and stuff like this. There's a difference between science and presumed facts. There's theories and facts. And sometimes theories are misworked facts. So when trying to express yourself in the terms of others, my channel does a lot of that. Either you may not be understanding what that person meant, or, in cases of some people, you definitely have, they don't know what the actual facts are. And I found there's the person who left Islam that spent some time with in person and more on the phone probably. And he left Islam because he was trying to interpret the Quran through contradictions and that arose in the Bible instead of what is attributed to Prophet Muhammad outside of this is the verses of the Quran that were revealed to me. And we definitely see the evidence, particularly starting with the Umayyad, Muawiyah, as it's called, the Abbasids and stuff, of the persecution of some of the more devout Muslims, killing included. And a lot of and reactionary movements to them, and reactionary movements to, we didn't do enough, are people who regretted taking part in these things. Pretty much, when you look at the divisions in the Islamic world, it's going to be about politics and scholars after Muhammad died, rather than actually what Muhammad said and what his and what was revealed to them. They say, all the basic things. I have the first masjid that I show on the sacred places list is a place where I've seen three types of Sufi, at least, 4 types of Sunni, a couple give sermons to the group. Now, a lot of people who didn't like one group or the other didn't. Oh, yeah, and I guess if you're going to say that the Salat Fasali, the Wahideen, if you're going to say they're different than the Sunni, then them too. And of course, a non-denominational guy, but they didn't really tell. As long as you don't bring up which caliphs are, who is in the right of things, that sometimes people murdering people considered to be Muslim for political rivalries, which necessary, or it was the position the people wanted somebody else, and they fought and killed for either mentioning it, or there were people clearly in the wrong there. But the importance, yes, we do have a response to political issues of all sorts, but the different opinions, they should all get together. And the minority communities of people who aren't Muslim, they're allowed a certain degree of autonomy. There's not really a punishment for blasphemy, apostasy, or disbelief. There's not really any fight of people for that reason. Some of the, one of the reasons why the idea of the crime quarter existed is because certain things like alcohol, which in modern countries, whether they're Muslim majorities or America, and are countries where it's completely considered acceptable, intoxicant use, alcohol is connected to most illness. It's connected to most major crime, it's connected. Uh, Other drugs are connected most of the rest. Even this take your happy pill and stuff like this, people are far more dangerous when they're withdrawing from the pills, and then it's being on the pills. It's like what somebody who's never been medicated is this safe that's a little or ADHD or a lot dangerous because they've been taking their meth, their amphetamine class drugs to deal with their ADHD, than somebody who's schizophrenic and never took any medication. Now, if they're an alcoholic, so there's some freedoms that are granted there, and certain, you know, and people got to work things out for themselves. Ghazali, just accepting tradition. He wanted to work things out otherwise. And there, you can say there's issues with Ghazali, and there's issues with what I have to find. Share it. Difference of the spirit, the law, the art was in conveying the message, in being stylistic, other than as opposed in other areas where it was about making the best graven images and certain games and but there was a lot of trying to compile world religion, trying to respond to world religion. It's supposed to be the confirmation of everything good and true that went before, and an update for an international age. And sometimes some people look and the cultural and civilization, which can be a different way of thinking, but it proper apart. There way too many started being leading prayers, being a scholarly professional thing for the most part. They're all doing it in a professional way. Now, your media and all that other stuff, fine. Nowadays, make money by selling your book. But selling is a very serious offense in Islam, actual Islam. Being a professional worshiper, but if you want to be the unlicensed counselor for, that's fine. Now, we were told to learn the languages of the peoples: Arabic, Hebrew, not Arabic. Arabic was what the Quran, Muhammad spoke. But that too, to understand it at its base. Latin, Greek, Syriac, Ethiopian, very specifically supposed to messages to translate the message into them, and also the cultural forms, hijab and abaya, sing like an Arab. There's choices that people have as believers. Be a believer and therefore live up to certain standards of honesty and otherwise, are to, not. There's legalism. If you've abandoned your prayer as a pillar of the faith, if you've shirked from monotheism, you're not considered Muslim. If you've raised your weapon against somebody called Muslim, then they've been murdering or raping or torturing or betraying the nation to such a serious degree, then you're not considered Muslim. I'm sorry, that's how it works. Now, sometimes you have to bring the criminal for a lesser offense, and things in, but that's different. Um, policy. There's a policy for taking care of those who don't believe as you do. And if even countries like Bangladesh, if those with money did their part, forget all this foreign aid instead of interest loans like your typical foreign aid, or let's give us part of control of your country, which leads to more poverty, food stores and stuff. The Britain, the French away food stuff from people, costing in some places digits worth of people's lives. Totaling, the secular movement has killed like 15 times or even 20 times as many people as all the Muslim majority countries combined in history. And you can't all attribute that to Islam. But the immigration policy is what I want, is that basically anybody can go through the lands. Now, a monotheist, you're kind of banned from Mecca. But, and you shouldn't, but you're basically just allowed to go through the lands. Array is not considered the holy. Muqaddas doesn't include Arabia. Allowed to go through, as the Quran says, you're allowed to go through, and you're supposed to, because you're going to encounter Islamic culture, actual Islamic culture. You're going to hear what the Quran has to say about some things, what Muhammad had to say about some things, in confirmation of what came before to the many prophets of humanity. Find out about that by being present in the Islamic lands. Now, there is, when it comes to immigrants being considered, or people who don't believe being considered as enemies of society, and they're trying to break up families and stuff like this, that's can be considered a little bit different, but there's basically an open immigration policy. Now, when I say that, there's, so I think that's all I can tie this. So you learn about a path or a particular understanding of a path from those people themselves, and they may tell you something a little bit different than what you expect. So this popular and political Islam you hear about on the news, and you hear about Islam Observed, which has very little to do with Islam, just some cultures basically leaving out more of the religious teachings. Basically, right? But from an era where people didn't really seem to talk about the Wahhabi, and the Protestants were like, hey, these people are trying to go back to the source and figure out how to follow their faith. We support that. Your typical fundamentalist movement in Christianity glosses over things in the Bible, and some of those things we don't. The killing of apostates and not letting non-Christians in one's home, and but there are certainly good things that good people of all groups, of all labels, are going to do. And looking at the cultural inflections of certain Muslim majority societies preserves stuff that goes Quran, but Islam is not a term that only means something that's 1440 plus another 13 years old.